How's it going, everyone? This video is going to be about relative strength and correlation between ES and NQ. Now, if you haven't already, go ahead and click that subscribe button and let's get into the video. So what is relative strength or weakness? Relative strength or weakness is when comparing two assets, one is more bearish or bullish than the other. So for example here, in comparing these two charts, it's pretty easy to see that this chart is more bullish than this chart. So this would be relatively stronger in comparison to this one. Similarly, as we move down here, when you compare this chart to this chart is much weaker than this one. So I would say that this was relatively weaker in comparison to this chart. So let's look at a few examples explaining this. So the main things I look for in judging relative strength or weakness is swing points as well as candle closures and the size of the candle. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at this swing high right here on ES and NQ. That was put in on the same date, Wednesday the 19th of July. Now if you notice here, ES hangs around this area on this next candle. You can see not a very big candle down, while NQ gets this massive drop. It's pretty clear to see that NQ is weaker here. Now another thing that tells me that is when we come back up to the swing point here. ES takes out this swing point, NQ does not even get close. So that also shows that ES is relatively stronger or moving higher, while NQ is relatively weaker or failing to make that new high. Also, if we go to this week's current price action, there's a few other ways I look at this. For example, here we have this order block right here. I'll go ahead and mark that out. Now, if you notice here, NQ has been relatively weaker than ES in this section of price. And so when price returns to this order block here, you can see we close out of the opening price of this order block and price respects the mean threshold of it. However, on ES here, you can see once we do get the close below this order block, price comes back through this range and it doesn't really respect the mean threshold of this order block, right? It goes all the way through to Monday's high and sweeps that out, putting an SMT in before closing back below. Another thing to notice is NQ's movement out of this order block. When NQ respects this order block, it gets a nice push lower here, while ES struggles to move much lower. This shows the relative strength in ES and the relative weakness in NQ. Now this is important because if I'm looking for short setups, I know that NQ will generally present a cleaner and better short setup, while ES will present a better and cleaner long setup. So let's take a quick look at SMTs before I hop into what I have found to make relative strength and weakness easy. Now another way to view relative strength and weakness between correlated assets is to look at SMT, or divergences between those assets. Now I'll link a video right up here in the top right. However, we'll go over a quick example of what this is. So you can see here on this asset, we put in a low and then we put in a higher low. However, on a correlated asset, we put in a low and then a lower low. This divergence can signify not only a reversal, but also can be used to show relative strength. So let's go take a look at this on the chart. So here we are back out on the daily chart, and first let's take a look at this swing point up here, Wednesday the 19th of July. So if you notice here, from this swing point, ES makes a higher high while NQ fails to do so. It makes a lower low. This is an SMT right here. Now what this can show is that NQ is relatively weaker to ES. ES put in a higher high while NQ failed to do that and put in a lower high. So this can ultimately show weakness in NQ and relative strength in ES. So let's take a look at one more example. If you notice, we have a swing point here on Monday, the 10th. Now if we mark that out, you can see NQ shows its relative weakness as it went all the way down to that swing point and made a low. Now ES is nowhere close to that, so what does that do? It makes an SMT, and on this time frame, it shows that ES is relatively stronger and NQ is relatively weaker. So let's take a look at what I have found to make relative strength and weakness easy for ES and NQ. What I do is I go to TradingView and I chart out ES divided by NQ. And what this does is when I'm looking at the chart of ES and NQ, if it is bullish, I know that ES has the relative strength and NQ has the relative weakness. If it is bearish, I know that ES has the relative weakness and NQ has the relative strength. So for example here, if this is the ES divided by NQ chart, as we are trending down here, we know that ES is relatively weaker, and NQ is relatively stronger. And then we put in a reversal here. We know that ES NQ is bullish, so ES is relatively stronger and NQ is relatively weaker. Now I understand this can be a bit overwhelming, so let's hop into the charts and go over a few examples. So here we are on the charts. We have our ES divided by NQ chart right here, our ES and NQ charts over here, all on the daily time frame as shown here. So we're going to go ahead and walk through each day of this week, just showing how to use the relative strength and weakness of this chart for ES and NQ. First, I want to show you what I was anticipating for this area and this week. So we'll go ahead and throw that up on the screen. Now you can see I was expecting a move down into that fair value gap before an expansion out of there. With that, I was able to predict the relative strength in ES and relative weakness in NQ after that Friday. So let's take a look at Friday and what it did, and then we'll go through each day of the week. I can't replay this particular ticker, so this one will have to stay how it is, but we will replay with ES and NQ. But if you notice here, Friday we get a move down and then back up. So if we think about this, what does that give? This gives relative weakness to ES and relative strength to NQ before we get a reaction out of here. So looking at this Friday, if we look at this fair value gap here and mark off this order block, you can see that on Friday, NQ actually had some relative strength, right? It got a move higher into this order block before closing back inside the range, right? While ES retched up into the fair value gap, couldn't reach the order block, and then closed below this range. So that is how I could see NQ being relatively stronger on this Friday. Now we get Monday, we got a reaction out of this fair value gap, and I'm expecting a bullish move for the rest of this week here. So with that, I'm expecting ES to be relatively stronger and NQ to be relatively weaker. So let's go ahead and skip forward a day. So here we are on our Monday. Now, what do we expect? We expect relative strength in ES and relative weakness in NQ. So what do we get? ES opens and just immediately moves higher, right? And if we mark out the CE of this wick, just so we can see how they relatively compare to each other, we can see that ES almost reaches that consequent encroachment, while NQ is nowhere close to that. So let's go to the next day. So here we are on the next day, still same thesis that ES should be stronger than NQ. And what do we get? Well, we get a move lower here on NQ. They both take these lows. However, look at the closure here. Let's go ahead and mark out the mean threshold of this order block as well as the opening price. So if you notice on this day, ES, expecting it to be relatively stronger, sweeps this low and then gets a move all the way back almost to the mean threshold of this order block, closing inside the body of this order block. Now with NQ, we sweep this low. We don't even make it back to the mean threshold, and we close outside the body of this order block. So here we are on the next day, and you can see ES does get a little reaction here. We go take this low, but we close back inside, right? What do we get on NQ here? We respect that mean threshold of the order block, and then we go and close below this low. So you can see how the relative weakness compares to ES here. So once again, still expecting relative strength in ES, relative weakness in NQ. What does NQ do? Well, we reach up to the mean threshold once again before coming back lower, sweeping this low, and then closing right here. Now, what does ES do? It reaches all the way back up to Monday's high, sweeps that into the CE of this wick before coming back down and closing like so. So you can see Friday, we do take previous day low on both of them, but you can see how ES sweeps this low, comes back in the range, while NQ closes outside. This just shows the relative weakness in NQ. Now let's hop into Friday's price action and show how this can actually be used with some examples. Now expecting ES NQ to move higher, I'm expecting ES to be relatively stronger and NQ to be relatively weaker. So here we have the 5-minute chart from Friday's price action. Now if you notice, our higher time frame levels here are on NQ. This is last month's low or the monthly fair value gap. And then this is the daily fair value gap on ES with the consequent encroachment marked out. Understanding that NQ is relatively weaker to ES, I would be looking for short setups on NQ down into last month's low. And you can see this as we zoom in here. You can see that NQ can barely reach up into this fair value gap before getting an aggressive displacement candle lower, as ES reaches back up into the consequent encroachment of this fair value gap and then moves lower. Now, where I really noticed it on Friday was right here in this fair value gap. NQ reaches up, the bodies respect the consequent encroachment. We put in a up close candle displaced lower, while ES reaches above this fair value gap before reaching lower. Now, understanding this and that ES is likely to be stronger than NQ, I can look for long setups out of this point of interest. And in this case, we have an SMT on the low, displacement up, a return to a consequent encroachment of this fair value gap before reaching the morning highs. Now it's really evident that ES is stronger here, as NQ fails to take these morning highs and then puts in an SMT. I hope this example was helpful and showed how I use ES divided by NQ to understand the relative strength between ES and NQ, and then use that and drop down to the lower time frames. However, there is one more section on how I use this, so let's get into that. The last thing I want to talk about is a theory I've come up with, and that theory is that reversals on the ES and Q comparison chart can be used to show the change in correlation and used to anticipate a reversal on ES or NQ and or determine relative strength. And so what do I mean by that? Well, when the ES and Q chart reverses, that's showing a change in correlation. And so here, ES is weak while NQ is strong, and when it reverses, NQ is becoming weaker and ES is becoming stronger. So it's kind of like an SMT without an SMT. And from what I've seen is it sometimes will be ahead of the reversal that actually occurs on the charts. So let's get into a few examples of this. So here's a quick example of a reversal on the ES and Q comparison chart. We sweep this high right here, fall back inside the range. This happens at 9:30. And so what can I anticipate from this is that if this is forming a reversal, I want to see a reversal on the ES or NQ chart, which if we go to 9:30, we do form a reversal at open. Now, what else can I take away from this? If this is moving down, ES is weaker, NQ is stronger, and that's pretty clear as we see this move up here on NQ. You can see it closing over this high while ES struggles to break over this high, and then also with this SMT here. You can see that NQ is just stronger, and then as we're pushing up into these new highs here, it's continuing up as ES is struggling to stay above that previous hour candle. So here we have our last example. So just looking at this as a change in correlation, when we put in a low here at 9:35, I've marked it out on ES and NQ, and you can see we put in a high here before moving lower, and ES hangs around a little bit, but then makes a move lower. Now, where I thought it was interesting is right here as at 10 is when we put in a high on the ES NQ chart. However, we don't put in a low until 10:05 on ES or NQ. Here it kind of led or gave indication prior to the actual reversal that a reversal may be coming here. So I thought this was pretty interesting. However, I would like to know your guys' thoughts on this, and if you go ahead and experiment or find anything out, please let me know either in the comments below or in the Discord. I do appreciate you guys watching. If you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya.